session is about idle management and how we avoid wasting power when we're idle. So we have been working on this for quite a while now in Linaro, and I think we have been mentioning this as SOC idling. And I'll give you a walkthrough of what that actually means, and we're going to look into some of the related frameworks that's involved in this, and we're also going to have show you some examples of how you can do it. And we're also going to look into something that we call a Runtime PM centric approach, and I'm going to explain a little bit about that. And then we're also going to look a little bit about what we're actually doing right now and some other highlights within this area. So yeah, by the way, I haven't been feeling that well, so we have to apologize if you find me being a little bit dizzy, and Lena will help me out if it's needed. And don't hesitate to interrupt during the session. Please ask questions whenever you feel. Okay, so idling, what do we mean? So clearly it's about avoid wasting power when we don't have anything, when we don't have anything to do, when we're idle. And most people talk about CPUs when you talk about idle, but of course there is a lot of other resources on an SoC that you need to manage, and which you can put into low power state when they're idle, so to say. So what we have been doing in this area is that we have been working on these frameworks that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and try to nail out some issues that's been, especially problems when you have an ARM SoC, and we're trying to fix those cases. And so our main goal is, of course, to enable for all the ARM SoC vendors to deploy PM support for our SoCs. So perhaps I should say also that if we look into the upstream version of the kernel, and there's of course a lot of drivers and being used of different SOCs and so forth, but there is often lacking PM support in these drivers. So in the downstream versions of the trees, in the vendor trees, obviously they have implemented this PM support there. So there is a gap somewhere here. We are trying to minimize that gap by helping out in this field. So let's go into some of the frameworks. This is the most interesting ones, I think, and I will walk you through a little bit about how they work and how they don't work. So let's start with the system PM and runtime PM frameworks. So system PM is a framework that is designed to bring down the whole entire system. So this happens, for example, when you close the lid on the laptop, or you press the power button on your Android device, and then the whole system goes into a low power mode, goes into sleep. So what I'm going to focus now in this presentation is not the entire part of the system PM. I'm going to focus on the part that is related to the devices. There is a lot of other stuff that goes on as well, but there is a lot of registered devices in the system, and system PM deals with all those devices when it goes to idle. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There is also another feature that's related to system PM. That's something we have called auto sleep, and those that's familiar with Android's wake locks, this is very related to this. So in principle, instead of that, you actually have to close the lid, which means that there will be a notification going to the kernel saying that now you should go to sleep. This auto sleep feature is actually more an opportunistic way of dealing with this. So the kernel always tries to go to sleep. So then there has to be like use cases running to prevent the kernel to go to sleep. So it's the same thing that happens, but it's just a mechanism of pushing down the system into sleep mode. And this is what Android has been using for a long time now. So Runtime PM, so what differs between System PM and Runtime PM is that Runtime PM is more fine-grained, and it can be used when there is, let's say that you have a device that is served for some I/O request, and then all of a sudden this I/O request stops coming and you're idle, you don't have anything else to do at the moment. The system is still up and running, so instead of just waiting, keeping all the power resources up and running for this device, Runtime PM enables you to bring down this device into a low power state. So the next time it's going to be used, you have to bring it back up again. So it's a more fine-grained method of dealing with idle on power management. So if you look back into the history, it's been really problematic of using these two frameworks together. There wasn't much of a coordination going on between these frameworks, and yeah, it was really hard actually to deploy support for this, especially in the ARM world. So some of the really important milestones happened. That's quite a while ago, but there is this kconfig options in the kernel. And when you remove one of these combinations, there is something that's called config PM runtime, and config PM sleep. And when you get different combinations of these, it gets even trickier to get all the corner cases nailed out, and it's hard to get the code optimized. So by removing some of these combinations, it gets a lot easier. So that's what happened a while ago. Another really important milestone was that we added a bunch of helper functions, which is supposed to, during System PM, you're supposed to use these helpers, which kind of makes these two System PM and Runtime PM frameworks better talk to each other. So then we have the concept of PM domain that was introduced in the Linux kernel way back ago. So I just wanted to mention this briefly, and the idea is really simple, that those devices that may share resources and perhaps needs to be managed in a controlled manner together, then we have the PM domain concept, which allows you to do that in the Linux kernel. So this is just the typical PM domain that I've thrown up there. You might have a couple of devices, and the shared resource here is the power rail. So the PM domain helps you with this. And this is going to be a little bit more detailed, but my point here is that we have a bunch of PM callbacks, which you can associate with a device on different levels. And some of these, there's a lot of callbacks, as you see here. And it would have been nice if it's been a few of those, but this will probably stay, or may, at least the Runtime PM parts, we probably won't see less of these, at least short term. So some of these are related to System PM, and some of these are related to Runtime PM. And when I was talking about the PM domain, so how this PM domain concept actually works in theory is that it, or in practice, means that you have a hierarchy that is being respected in these frameworks, and on top of the hierarchy you have the PM domain. So when the PM core starts to suspend operation, it will walk this hierarchy and see, okay, this device has a PM domain associated. And this PM domain then has these callbacks set up. And if it doesn't have a PM domain, it continues in the hierarchy, and there is something that you call a bus type in the struct device, and it invokes that, see if those callbacks has been set up for the bus, and so forth. And the driver is in the bottom of the hierarchy. So this is an area that we have been working on now lately. The generic PM domain. So to describe this very easy is that on those SOC where we see that there is a need to use the concept of a PM domain, you often have the same similar problems when you want to deploy support for this. And instead of duplicating a lot of code for all the SOCs, we have invented the generic PM domain to help out with all the infrastructure parts. So what it allows you to do is that you can describe your PM domain topology and how the devices is connected to that in the device tree. So it allows you to group these devices in domains. And it also helps with attaching of the devices in runtime, so when the system starts up, so you get these devices associated with our domains. And of course, in some SOCs, you don't have one domain, you might have a nested topology. So you need to have subdomains and master domains, so it's, can get really, really complex. And of course, there needs to be some SOC-specific methods, so you can actually power off your domain, and then there's callbacks to deal with this. So I'm not going to go into the detail of how the generic power domain works, the mechanics behind it, but the important thing here is that the devices that you put into the generic power domain needs to be, GMPD relies on that these devices are being managed by Runtime PM and System PM in their respective subsystem and drivers. So there is a relationship here that needs to be maintained. So this is just an overview of what how it could look like. So you have a big PM domain, and it has a subdomain with a bunch of devices here and there. And all this stuff is possible to describe in DT. So you probably can't read DT description here, but that's not the point. You can keep it as a reference. The slides will be available. So when you put these devices into a low power state, obviously you will avoid to waste power, which is the whole idea behind putting them into a low power state. But when you do that, the next time you're going to serve a request, when we talk about the Runtime PM point of view, you need to bring the device up to full power again so it can start to be functional. And that, of course, introduces a latency. So when there is a request coming in, it will suffer from an initial latency before it actually can start, before the actual device can start taking care of dealing with the request. So in some situation, this latency is completely acceptable, and of course it depends on how big the latency is. And in some other cases, you just don't want to, you just can't accept this kind of latency. So to deal with these kind of situations, there is a framework called Dev PMQS, and it allows you to set these kind of constraints on the device, on the device, yeah. So then there is a mechanics inside GMPD where you can attach a governor to your power domain. So before the GMPD starts, before the device actually goes in, when the device is about to go into a low power state, this governor validates these constraints and see if those can be met. And if it's not, it will not allow the power state. In some cases, you can get kind of in a situation where you get kind of bursts of a request. So you can accept this latency, but you don't want to have this latency all the time. So then you have a feature inside the Runtime PM that is called auto-suspend, and that in principle means that you have the option to defer the suspend until in a little while. So you can set a timer saying that now the device can go idle, but let's wait for, like, say, 50 milliseconds. So if there comes in a request within that window, the device is still functional, so you don't have to bring it back up or down. So that's another option that's being used. Any questions so far? Okay. Yes? No, I don't think so. So how do we do this? How do we deploy the PM support? Obviously, there is a lot of variants methods of how you do it, but I just wanted to show you one method that I've seen. That most people start caring about the system PM support. That is the most important thing. So they start implementing the system PM, and when that is done, they realize, oh, I'm really interested in runtime PM as well. So then they add runtime PM on top. And they forgot about the wake-up setting, so they have to squeeze them in later. So with wake-up, it's I don't know. It's when the device goes into a low power state, it needs to be able to wake up in some form. And in some cases, you have a separate configuration to deal with that. And then, as a first step, they realized, oh, I have a bunch of PM domains in my system, so I need to deploy MPD. And this works, of course. It's a little bit tricky to do it, but it works. So what I'm saying here is that I think there is actually an easier way to do this, and it's kind of the opposite way of doing it. So it's easier if you start deploying the power domain supports from the beginning, where you do all the DTB updates and configure all the systems and put the devices in their respective domains. And then you start deploying runtime PM support. And when you have deployed the runtime PM support, if you use this so-called runtime PM centric approach, and we'll explain that a little bit more later, you might get the system PM for free. So, yeah. The idea is that this will save you a bunch of steps that you need to take. So just some quick words of what you need to do when you deploy the MPD support. So we were talking about the DTB, of course. That needs to be updated, and you need to put the devices in their respective domains. And of course, you have some SOC-specific parts that you need to implement. And then when you have done that, you're going to register your generic power domain via an API from MPD. And you also have an OF provider that you're going to register. And perhaps if you have subdomain, those also needs to be registered in the system. And nowadays, there is actually plenty of good examples there. That wasn't the case a while ago. And then, when you have done that, you start with the runtime PM approach, the runtime PM deployment. And I'm going to look a little bit about this runtime PM-centric approach now. So the whole idea with this is that if you have a look and see how devices are being managed from power management point of view, system-wise and runtime PM-wise, you often see that it's actually the same operations that's being done for a device. And in some cases, they are very, very similar. So instead of duplicating the code, you need to implement all this stuff in all the different callbacks. Let's try to make reuse the code, and that is the whole idea with this. And also to cover some of the corner cases when you combine these two PM frameworks. So you start by deploying your runtime PM in your device driver or in your system, and you make sure that you have considered the wake-ups so you don't forget about them. Then, after after that, all you have to do is that these other system PM related callbacks, you just assign them to this helper function that I've mentioned earlier. And then you're done. So it looks like this. You have, when you have deployed runtime PM support, this is all you need to deploy the system PM support in your device driver or in your subsystem. Really easy. Just wanted to mention some latest achievements that we have been working on in Linaro lately. Is that we have seen that system PM related code in the generic power domain wasn't that behaving that well, so we wanted to optimize it a little bit. And particularly devices were being brought back into full power unnecessary during the system PM phase, both when you bring the system into the sleep state and when you wake it up from sleep state. Even if devices wasn't being used, they were still going to be powered up and then to just really shortly after being powered down again. So it not only wasted power, but it takes time, which seems unnecessary. So this is what we've been working on. And the first part, which is when you go into sleep state, that is fixed. But when you wake up, there is still some pieces that we need to fix. And one other thing that happens to the power domain was EMPD was that we added support to be able to remove the power domain. So, yeah, that could be useful if you have a driver that fails to probe or something like that. So some ongoing work in this area. So some cases, obviously, we want to measure power physically on the boards. When that isn't feasible, and it's not the case for all the boards that we are developing on. The idea here is that we want to be able to collect some power statistics instead. So this is something that we have been working on adding into MPD so that you can find out how long a power domain has been in a low power state and how long devices in there has been in low power state. Yeah, and get some statistics of that, which allows us to, when we improve the deploy runtime PM, deploy system PM support here and there, you can go in and collect statistics and see that, okay, we are at least moving in the right direction. We're improving things. In those cases when we can't measure power. So that's the idea here. Hopefully we will get something in the next release cycle of the kernel for this. And some other thing that we have been working on, which is really interesting, is that instead of deploying this runtime PM support in each and every leaf driver, more and more subsystem, core part of the subsystem is deploying this runtime PM support, which of course enables the leaf drivers to do less from a runtime PM point of view. They more or less only have to enable runtime PM and then everything works because the core part in the subsystem takes care of what's needed in this. So, there is a lot of subsystem that's already deployed for this, and yeah, I've listed them here, and there's more. And there is a lot of subsystem that's being discussed on the LKML list of moving this runtime PM support into the core part of their subsystem. In some cases, it's not feasible. In some cases, it is, and all those cases where it actually is feasible, it would make sense to have it in there. So I probably see that that's going to happen for a bunch of new subsystems that has deployed this. And there is another thing that's being worked on as well, and that is a long outstanding issues of how you can describe dependencies dependencies, functional dependencies between devices. So in some cases you have a device driver that's, that wants to probe, but this device driver relies on another device being probed first. And this kind of relationship isn't, I mean, there is only this parent-child relationship between, that you can describe, but there is no, for other kind of dependencies, there's not possible, it's not possible to describe that in the Linux kernel today. So this is something that's being worked on by Raphael, the PM4 maintainer, and it's really useful. It will solve some more of these corner cases that we have been working on now for a while. So this is really interesting. If you want to be involved, there's a couple of links there. And then we have the work that Lena is doing, particularly with CPUs. I don't know if you want to. Yep. Okay. So the idea we have here is that we have seen that the CPU idle framework isn't really scaling well for the multi-cluster SMP system, like Big Little. So we wanted to see if we could use Runtime PM together with the generic power domain to also cover CPUs. So we are exploring this, and Lena has posted a couple of versions of the patch set that's using this. And the reason why we want to use Runtime PM and EMPD to solve this kind of idle management problem for this kind of multi-cluster system is that it has all the building blocks that is needed. So it's more or less a perfect match to solve this problem. And another thing is that we also see that this Runtime PM deployment is we get a unified solution to deal with idle management for all devices in the system, which is really nice. So what we've been doing here is that we have, I don't know if you know about the power management integration tree we have in Linaro. So we have a tree that has some patches that we're working on upstreaming, but hasn't reached the mainline kernel yet. So this tree has this kind of series that Lena has worked on for this multi-cluster thing, and we have enabled 2 ARM64 SoCs support in there, and so it's being tested now. It's been tested for a while, and it's really easy to use this solution. You only have to do DTB updates, and that's it. It works out of the box. So if you have some other platform that you think could be a match for this, just talk to us, and we can enable support for it here. And it will be good because we get an even wider test scope for this. So yeah, this is a hot topic. So we're talking a lot with some of the ARM guys here about some DT bindings discussions currently, but we also have a lot of discussions with the community. In the big. So there will be a talk about this in the Linux Plumbers in November, which is only focused to this problem that we're trying to solve. Okay. Some other questions? So this is just the final slide I have here. I just wanted to share some trends and some news. So it's more of saying that we are doing a good job. That is actually what I wanted to say here, because if you see it, if you look at some of the trends here, at 3.18, that is actually when Linaro started to get involved of evolving the generic power domain to be a better generic power domain. And if you see there, it's a clear trend that it's actually being used a lot now more than it was before. It was was actually invented already in 3.1. So between 3.1 and 3.18, nothing happened, almost. So we see a huge trend now, and this is really interesting. So clearly, this has been a feature that needed a modernization so people could use it. And the other thing here is the Runtime PM centric approach that I've been talking about. So it was added a while ago, but I think lately people are actually seeing this as really good. It took some time to get people really involved and understand that the real benefit of using it. So I'm hoping that we will see an even increased trend of using this. That's it. Unless you have some questions. Lunch? Yep.
So the functional dependency, is it working? The functional dependency patch you're mentioning, do you know if there's any intent to use it for improving deferred probing kind of stuff too? Like to avoid deferred probing when devices are probed from DT?
Yeah.
Do you plan to use that to optimize it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it could.
But there's no current plan to do it though, right? Is there no current plan to do it, or is that the intent of it? Okay. Okay.
Okay.